In 1974, inside the massive Ford engine plant in Brook Park, Ohio, the line went quiet. The final American-cast 351 Cleveland V8 was pulled from the assembly floor. Just 4 years earlier, in 1970, this engine had been unleashed as the ultimate street and track weapon. It featured massive canted-valve cylinder heads and dominated NASCAR ovals and local drag strips. Yet by 1974, the line was completely shut down. Mechanics lost the greatest factory-breathing engine of the muscle car era. Hot rodders were left scouring salvage yards for leftover iron, while Ford dealerships filled their lots with heavy, choke-down replacements. A few years earlier, its massive intake ports meant American racing dominance. Now those exact same ports made it a casualty. The engine had not lost its power. It had simply lost the world that allowed it to breathe. But the real story of the 351 Cleveland is not only the story of a canceled production line in 1974. It is the story of how American horsepower reached its absolute mechanical peak just seconds before the rulebook changed forever. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific problem on the high-speed banks of NASCAR and the stoplights of Detroit in 1969. In the late summer of 1969, the American horsepower war was running out of cubic inches and running out of real estate. You could only make an engine block so massive before it ruined the handling of a car, refused to fit between the narrow shock towers of a pony car, or became too heavy for the street. Ford had already pushed the physical boundaries of the engine bay with their massive 428 and 429 big blocks. But the battleground was shifting. The most vicious fights on local drag strips, dealership lots, and the high-speed banks of NASCAR weren't just about total displacement anymore. They were about efficiency. They were about RPM. They were about breathing. For Ford, the immediate problem was the 351 Windsor. Introduced for the 1969 model year and built primarily at the Windsor engine plant in Ontario, Canada, the 351 Windsor was created by extending the stroke of the beloved 302 small block V8. Stroke is the distance the piston travels up and down inside the cylinder. By increasing this distance, Ford created a durable, torque-heavy engine. It was perfectly suited for pulling a heavy Ford Galaxy away from a stoplight or powering a family station wagon down the newly expanded interstate highway system. But on a Friday night at a drag strip in California, or on the banking of Daytona, the Windsor had a fatal flaw. It hit an invisible wall at about 5,000 RPM. The problem was not the block. The problem was the cylinder heads. A cylinder head is the heavy iron cap bolted to the top of the engine block. It seals the cylinders and contains the intake and exhaust passages, known as ports, as well as the valves that open and close to let fuel and air in and exhaust gases out. The Windsor used a traditional inline valve arrangement with relatively small restrictive ports. When a driver mashed the throttle and the engine speed climbed, the engine desperately tried to pull in more fuel and air. But the Windsor's small ports acted like a cocktail straw. The engine choked. It simply could not move enough air to feed its 351 cubic inches of displacement at high engine speeds. In the ruthless American car market of 1969, choking at high RPM meant losing on Sunday, which meant losing sales on Monday. Chevrolet's small block V8s were famous for their ability to rev freely. Chrysler's engines were dominating with massive breathing capability. Ford needed a mid-size engine that could fit into a Mustang or a mid-size Torino, but breathe like a purebred racing machine. They needed an engine that did not just produce low-end torque, but could scream past 6,000 RPM and pull continuously without starving for air. The solution was the 335 series engine family, a completely new architecture designed strictly for high performance. And to build it, Ford turned to the Cleveland Engine Plant No. 1 in Brook Park, Ohio. This massive industrial complex, sprawling across acres of the Midwestern Rust Belt, was a cathedral of American manufacturing. It was a place where thousands of union workers turned raw iron ore, extreme heat, and sand cores into the beating hearts of American automobiles. In late 1969, for the 1970 model year, The foundry floors at Cleveland began pouring a completely new V8 block. This new block shared the same 351 cubic inch displacement as the Windsor and the same 4.38-inch bore spacing, the distance between the centers of the cylinders. But the similarities ended there. The Cleveland block was cast with thicker main bearing webs to handle the violent stress of high RPMs. It featured a unique dry intake manifold system, meaning the engine coolant did not flow through the intake manifold as it did on the Windsor. Instead, it routed directly through the block and a unique timing cover extension. This prevented hot engine coolant from heating up the incoming air-fuel mixture. A critical detail because cooler air is denser, and denser air makes more horsepower. Almost overnight, the introduction of the 351 Cleveland created a division at the American parts counter. When a shade tree mechanic or a local racer walked into a Ford dealership or a local auto parts store in the spring of 1970 and asked for a gasket, a water pump, or a set of spark plugs for a 1970 Mustang with a 351, the parts guy behind the counter had to ask a new question: Windsor or Cleveland? The two engines shared a displacement number, but they shared almost zero interchangeable parts. The Windsor used a 5-bolt valve cover. The Cleveland used an 8-bolt cover. The Windsor routed water through the intake. The Cleveland routed it through the block. It was a logistical headache for the service network, requiring double the inventory for water pumps, Renner gaskets, and manifolds. But Ford's management and dealership network accepted this headache because the performance payoff was undeniable. When the 1970 Ford models hit dealership lots across America, mechanics and hot rodders opened the hoods and realized immediately that the 351 Cleveland was an entirely different animal. It looked wider, more aggressive, and heavier across the top. The valve covers were massive and flat, completely different from the narrow, stamped covers of the Windsor. The Cleveland engine plant was pumping out these blocks by the thousands, sending them down assembly lines to be dropped into the engine bays of Mustang Mach 1s, Mercury Cougars, and Ford Torinos. It was an engine designed for a very specific window of American history, a time when gasoline was cheap, emissions regulations were practically non-existent, and the only thing that mattered to a young buyer standing in a dealership showroom was whether the car could beat a Chevrolet Camaro to the next traffic light. The 351 Cleveland had arrived to solve Ford's RPM problem. It was loud, it was thirsty, and it was unapologetically aggressive. The iron foundation poured in Ohio was arguably the strongest mid-size block Ford had ever built. But a cast iron foundation was only the beginning. The real violence of the Cleveland would be found inside its massive, heavy-breathing cylinder heads. To understand why the 351 Cleveland became an immediate legend, you have to imagine a mechanic walking into an American garage in 1970, unbolting the heavy valve cover from a brand new Mustang and looking at the valve train for the very first time. If that mechanic was used to traditional Ford engines like the Windsor or standard Chevrolet small blocks, they expected to see the valves, the metal stems and flat heads that open to let air in and exhaust out, arranged in a neat straight row. But under the massive valve covers of the 351 Cleveland, the architecture was entirely different. The valves were tilted, angled away from each other in multiple directions. This was the canted valve cylinder head. A canted valve design is a mechanical layout where the valves are tilted on compound angles, rather than standing straight up and down in a line. To a weekend hot rodder, it looked chaotic. To a race engineer, it looked like perfection. By tilting the valves, Ford's engineers could make them significantly larger without them hitting the walls of the cylinder bore. Even more importantly, when a canted valve opens, it points directly toward the center of the cylinder. It unshrouds itself, allowing the air-fuel mixture to rush in freely rather than bouncing off the cylinder wall. It was pure racing technology, developed on the brutal tracks of NASCAR, and Ford was now unceremoniously bolting it onto factory street cars. But the canted valves were only half of the breakthrough. The true violence of the 351 Cleveland was hidden inside its cast iron breathing passages. Ford offered the Cleveland in two main variations: the 2AV, meant for two-barrel carburetors, and the legendary 4V, designed for high-performance four-barrel carburetors. An intake port is the tunnel cast into the cylinder head that guides the explosive mixture of fuel and air into the engine. On a traditional mid-size V8, these ports were modest, designed to keep the air moving quickly at low speeds, which created the low-end pulling power, torque, that made stop-and-go driving comfortable. When mechanics pulled the intake manifold off a 4V Cleveland, they were stunned. The intake and exhaust ports were absolutely massive. They were so large that a person could easily slide a tennis ball deep into the intake runners. This was an engine explicitly designed to ingest as much fuel and air as possible, regardless of consumption. It was a physical argument cast in iron. If you want to make high RPM horsepower, the measurement of how fast an engine can do work, you have to move massive volumes of air. At low RPM, navigating through a grocery store parking lot, these huge ports were actually a disadvantage. The air moved sluggishly through the cavernous tunnels. The engine could feel surprisingly lazy off the line. But when the driver pushed the accelerator to the floor and the engine crossed 4,000 RPM, the sheer volume of those ports suddenly made sense. The Cleveland woke up. It began to scream, breathing deeply and effortlessly, pulling harder and faster right up to its red line. This high-speed breathing capability made the 351 Cleveland 4V an immediate terror on local drag strips and highway on-ramps. It solved the exact problem the Windsor could not. It did not choke. In 1971, Ford pushed this architecture to its absolute mechanical zenith with the Boss 351 Mustang. The Boss 351 took the Ohio cast Cleveland block and fitted it with a solid lifter camshaft, a valve train component that required precise manual adjustment, but allowed the engine to safely reach extreme rotational speeds. They added forged aluminum pistons, a high-performance 4-barrel carburetor, and a punishing 11.7.1 compression ratio. Compression is the intense squeezing of the air-fuel mixture inside the cylinder before the spark plug fires. Higher compression creates a more violent, powerful explosion, but it strictly requires expensive, high-octane leaded gasoline to prevent the engine from destroying itself. The Boss 351 was immediately recognized as one of the fastest, most capable small-block muscle cars ever produced in Detroit. It ran the quarter-mile in the 13-second range straight off the showroom floor. It was loud, heavy, and demanded constant maintenance, but it dominated almost everything it lined up against. The Cleveland's reputation for moving air and surviving extreme stress soon traveled far beyond American drag strips. When Alejandro de Tomaso, an Argentine-born automotive executive, wanted to build a mid-engine exotic sports car in Italy to rival Ferrari and Lamborghini, he did not want a temperamental, highly stressed European V12. He wanted something that could be serviced at any local dealership in America, but still possessed the high RPM lungs of a race car. He chose the Ford 351 Cleveland 4V. When the De Tomaso Pantera arrived on American shores, it featured a sleek Italian body wrapped around a massive cast-iron heart poured in Brook Park, Ohio. The Pantera proved that the canted-valve Cleveland was not just a brute-force American drag racing engine, it was a world-class power plant capable of pushing an exotic supercar to 160 miles per hour. By the end of 1971, the 351 Cleveland had cemented its place in the American garage hierarchy. It was the engine of choice for anyone who wanted to pull away from the pack at high speed. The factory lines in Ohio were running hot. The dealer networks were ordering Mach 1 Mustangs and Torinos as fast as they could sell them. The service manuals were thick with specifications for setting valve lash and tuning 4-barrel carburetors. The machine was running perfectly, dominating everything it touched. The market had not yet shown what would happen when an engine built entirely for high-speed airflow collided with a world that suddenly demanded less. By the summer of 1971, the 351 Cleveland had reached its absolute mechanical and cultural peak. To understand the scale of this engine's footprint, you have to look past the drag strips and go directly to the source, the Cleveland Engine Plant No. 1 in Brook Park, Ohio. At its height, this factory was not just a building, it was a sprawling industrial city. Thousands of union auto workers clocked in across multiple shifts, keeping the massive foundry fires burning around the clock. The air inside the plant was thick with the smell of hot sand molds and molten iron. Here, American labor poured liquid metal into intricate castings, creating the thick web blocks and massive ported cylinder heads that would soon define a generation of performance. The sheer volume of production was staggering. These blocks were machined, assembled, painted in classic Ford blue, and loaded onto rail cars, destined for assembly plants across the country. When those cars finally rolled off the transport trucks and onto the asphalt of local Ford dealership lots, they represented the pinnacle of naturally aspirated American power. The 1970 and 1971 Ford Mustang Mach 1, the sleek Mercury Cougar Eliminator, and the heavy, broad-shouldered Ford Torino GT all relied on the Cleveland to give them their pulse. For a young American walking into a dealership with a steady paycheck and a desire for speed, checking the option box for the M-Code 4V Cleveland or the legendary Boss 351 was a declaration of intent. It meant you were not buying a car just to commute. You were buying a machine built for violence. Out on the street, the 351 Cleveland changed the hierarchy of local car culture. In American garages, driveways, and local machine shops, the engine commanded a distinct mechanical respect. It required a specific ritual to keep it running at its absolute limit. Mechanics and weekend hot rodders spent their Saturday mornings leaning over the wide fenders of Mustangs, adjusting the float levels on massive Holley carburetors, devices that sat on top of the engine and metered the explosive mixture of fuel and air. They set the timing, checked the spark plugs, and listened to the heavy rhythmic idle echoing off garage walls. The physical sensation of a 4V Cleveland at wide-open throttle was unforgettable. At low engine speeds, the massive intake ports made the car feel slightly restless, like a heavy dog pulling at a leash. But when the driver found an open stretch of interstate, or lined up at a local quarter-mile track and pushed the pedal to the floor, the secondary barrels of the carburetor snapped open. The engine crossed 4,000 RPM, the airflow caught up to the massive port volume, and the heavy cast iron block transformed. The sound evolved from a deep rolling thunder into a high-pitched metallic scream. It pulled with a ferocity that seemed to defy the heavy weight of the steel chassis surrounding it. But this incredible mechanical performance was entirely dependent on a specific set of external conditions. The 351 Cleveland, particularly the high-compression Boss 351, was a machine that drank deeply from the American fuel supply. It required high-octane, leaded gasoline, fuel enriched with tetraethyl lead to prevent the engine from detonating under the massive pressure of its own cylinder compression. In 1971, this fuel was cheap and abundant. A driver could pull into a local Sunoco or Texaco station, fill the tank with premium 100-octane fuel for pennies a gallon, and drive out ready to spin the engine past 6,000 RPM. The ecosystem supporting the Cleveland was vast and deeply entrenched. The service networks were flooded with manuals detailing the exact specifications of the canted valve heads. The parts counters at local auto stores stocked the specific 8-bolt valve cover gaskets and heavy-duty water pumps. High-performance camshaft manufacturers and aftermarket intake builders designed entire product lines around the engine's massive breathing capability. The Cleveland was not just an engine family. It was an entire microeconomy of parts, labor, tuning, and racing. The machine had proven its dominance on the street, but to cement its legacy, it had to prove itself on the brutal, high-speed banks of America's greatest racing circuits. To understand the absolute peak of the 351 Cleveland, you have to look at the highest levels of American motorsport in the early 1970s. For Ford, the Cleveland was not just a showroom option, it was a homologation special, a production engine built specifically to legalize its parts for professional racing. When NASCAR began changing its rulebook in 1970 to crack down on massive 429 cubic inch and 426 cubic inch big block engines, they mandated restrictor plates to choke the airflow on the biggest motors, but the mid-sized engines were allowed to run without restriction. Ford's engineers knew exactly what they had built. The 351 Cleveland, with its massive 4V ports and canted valves, was uniquely positioned to exploit this rule change. In the engine-building shops of legendary NASCAR teams like the Wood Brothers, mechanics took the heavy iron blocks cast in Ohio and transformed them into high-endurance race engines. They found that the Cleveland's thick main bearing webs could survive hours of continuous abuse at 7,000 RPM. On the high-speed banking of Daytona and Talladega, a NASCAR-prepared 351 Cleveland did not sound like a traditional American V8. It possessed a shrieking, metallic howl, moving so much air and fuel that it could push a heavy Ford Torino aerodynamically through the wind at speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Simultaneously, the engine was completely rewriting the rules of the quarter mile. In the newly formed National Hot Rod Association, NHRA Pro Stock class, drag racers quickly realized that the factory-cast 351 Cleveland heads flowed better than almost anything else available from Detroit. Legendary drivers like Bob Glidden built their early careers on the breathing capability of the Cleveland. They dropped these high-winding small blocks into lightweight Ford Pintos and Mustangs, dumping high-octane racing fuel through dual carburetors. The result was absolute domination. The engine's ability to pull air effortlessly at high speeds meant it crossed the finish line still accelerating, while competitors gasped for breath. By 1971, the 351 Cleveland had achieved a mythological status across the American automotive landscape. It was the centerpiece of Ford's performance catalog, the terror of the NHRA, the workhorse of NASCAR, and the undisputed king of the Friday night stoplight drag race. The foundries in Brook Park were running at peak capacity. Dealerships were taking orders from buyers who strictly wanted the 4V heads and the high-compression pistons. In an America where an engine could decide whether a car pulled away from a toll booth, dominated a local drag strip, or survived 500 miles on a high-banked oval, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. The 351 Cleveland was the physical embodiment of an era that believed there was no problem in automotive engineering that could not be solved by adding more air, more fuel, and more RPM. It was the ultimate expression of the American high-performance V8, a machine that turned cheap gasoline into pure, naturally aspirated horsepower without the need for turbochargers or computer-controlled fuel injection. The engine was flawless for the world it was born into. But the market had not yet shown what would happen to an engine designed for massive airflow when the American rulebook and the American fuel pump suddenly demanded starvation. The decline of the 351 Cleveland did not begin with a padlock on a factory door or a sudden cancellation order from Ford executives. It began with a barely visible crack on a dealership spec sheet in the fall of 1971, right as the 1972 models were rolling onto American lots. When mechanics and local racers looked at the new factory manuals, they noticed something had changed. The legendary Boss 351 was gone, and across the board, the compression ratios on the Cleveland had plummeted. If a mechanic pulled the heavy iron cylinder heads off a 1972 351 Cleveland and set them on a workbench next to a 1970 version, the physical difference was obvious. Ford had changed the casting. The earlier, high-performance engines featured a closed chamber design, a tight, compact pocket in the cylinder head where the spark plug fired, which squeezed the fuel and air violently to create massive power. The new 1972 heads featured an open chamber design. The pocket was wider, shallower, and far less efficient. This drop in compression was not a mistake. It was a forced retreat, driven directly by Force 3 of the American engine market: regulation, emissions, fuel economy, and certification. The newly formed Environmental Protection Agency was beginning to enforce strict limits on tailpipe emissions, specifically targeting nitrogen oxides, or NOx. NOx is a pollutant created under extreme cylinder heat and pressure. The exact conditions that made a 1970 high-compression Cleveland so violent and powerful on a drag strip were the exact conditions the federal government was now trying to outlaw. To lower the NOx emissions, Ford had to lower the combustion temperatures. To lower the temperatures, they had to drop the compression ratio. At the exact same time, the engine was being squeezed by Force 4, fuel, oil, supply chains, and energy shocks. The American automotive industry was preparing for the mandated arrival of unleaded gasoline. For decades, tetraethyl lead had been added to cheap pump gas to lubricate engine valves and prevent high-compression engines from destroying themselves through premature detonation, known as engine knock. Without lead, the high-compression pistons of the early Cleveland would shatter under the stress. By 1972, the Cleveland was detuned. It still ran, but the sharp, violent snap of the throttle was dulled. In a local garage, hot rodders found themselves trying to advance the ignition timing and swap carburetor jets just to recapture the feeling of a car from 2 years prior. The engine was essentially suffocating, not from a lack of air, but from a lack of mechanical squeeze. Then came the true systemic shock. In the fall of 1973, the OPEC oil embargo hit the United States. Almost overnight, the supply of crude oil was choked off. Gasoline prices quadrupled. Long lines stretched around the block at local Texaco and Sunoco stations. For the first time in American history, fuel economy became a matter of national panic. The American consumer driving habits shifted instantly. Buyers no longer walked into a Ford dealership looking for a machine that could turn 7,000 RPM on a weekend track day. They were looking for something that could idle efficiently in a gas line and crawl through a 35-mile-per-hour suburban commute without burning through a week's pay. Here is the fatal irony of the 351 Cleveland. The very engineering breakthrough that made it a legend on the track now became its ultimate curse on the street. The problem was port velocity. When an engine operates at high RPM, it is pulling in air so rapidly that massive intake tunnels are necessary. But at low RPM, the speed a driver uses to pull away from a stoplight or navigate a grocery store parking lot, the engine is not pulling hard. In the massive cavern of a Cleveland 4V intake port, the air velocity slowed down drastically. It was like trying to force water from a high-pressure hose into a wide, slow-moving river. When the incoming air slowed down inside those giant iron tunnels, the heavy droplets of gasoline fell out of the air-fuel mixture. The fuel literally puddled on the floor of the intake manifold before it could reach the cylinder. The engine would stumble. It lost its low-end torque, the twisting force that gets a heavy car moving. To compensate, a driver had to push the gas pedal harder, forcing the carburetor to dump even more fuel down the massive throats just to keep the car from stalling. The result was an engine that felt sluggish in daily traffic while burning a catastrophic amount of fuel. The 351 Cleveland was perfectly engineered to move massive volumes of air at wide-open throttle, but it was completely incapable of sipping fuel at an idle. The engine was still a mechanical marvel. The block was still cast with the thickest webs in Ohio, but the physics of its own breathing had turned against it, and Ford was already quietly preparing the tooling for its replacement. By 1973 and 1974, Ford was facing an American automotive landscape that the 351 Cleveland was never designed to navigate. The new federal mandates required cars to run cleaner, which meant adding cumbersome emissions equipment. If a mechanic opened the wide, heavy hood of a new 1974 Ford Torino, the engine bay no longer looked like a temple of mechanical power. The crisp, clean cast iron of the early Cleveland was buried under a maze of vacuum hoses, thermal switches, and smog pumps. To reduce cylinder temperatures and meet EPA NOx standards, Ford introduced exhaust gas recirculation, or EGR. This system literally routed hot, oxygen-depleted exhaust gases directly back into the engine's intake manifold to be burned again. For an engine architecture that was explicitly engineered to ingest cold, dense, high-velocity air, forcing it to swallow its own hot exhaust was the ultimate mechanical insult. It choked the horsepower and covered the internal valves in thick carbon deposits. Furthermore, federal crash safety mandates required heavy steel bumpers and reinforced doors. A mid-size car in 1974 could weigh several hundred pounds more than the same model from 1970. To move these heavy, smog-choked land yachts safely away from a stoplight, Ford did not need high RPM horsepower. They needed low-end, off-the-line torque, and they needed an engine that could run on low-grade, unleaded fuel without knocking. The answer was not to redesign the 351 Cleveland. The answer was to replace it. Ford's engineers took the basic canted valve architecture of the Cleveland and stretched it. They cast a taller engine block, raising the deck height to accommodate a longer piston stroke, which created the low-revving 400 cubic inch V8. But as the emissions era deepened, Ford still needed a 351 cubic inch engine to fill a gap in their heavy passenger car and truck lineup. Instead of keeping the original race-bred Cleveland block alive, they took the taller, heavier 400 block and simply installed a shorter stroke crankshaft. This became the 351, commonly known in American garages as the 351 Modified. To the untrained eye or a casual buyer standing on a dealership lot in the late 1970s, the 351 looked deceivingly like the legendary Cleveland. It had the same wide valve covers. It used a similar canted valve head design, but the soul of the machine had been surgically removed. The 351M was cast with a taller, heavier block. The massive 4V intake ports that had terrified drag racers in 1970 were entirely gone. permanently replaced by restrictive two-barrel 2V ports meant to keep air velocity high at low engine speeds. The compression ratio was dropped into the basement, hovering around a dismal 8.01. The aggressive, solid-lifter camshafts of the early era were replaced by mild profiles designed only to reduce emissions. Even the transmission mounting pattern was changed. The 350mm used a large big block bell housing, meaning a mechanic could not easily swap the new engine in place of an older Windsor or true Cleveland without changing the transmission as well. In an American garage, the 350mm became a symbol of the smog era. It was incredibly durable, and it could reliably lug a heavy Ford F-150 pickup truck across a Midwestern farm, but it absolutely refused to rev. If a young driver bought a used 1977 Ford and tried to race it between stoplights, the engine simply groaned. It hit a wall at 4,000 RPM, strangled by its own restrictive heads, heavy pistons, and a web of emissions hoses. The canted valves were still there, but without the compression, the airflow, and the rich leaded fuel, they were merely a mechanical echo of a dead era. Back in Ohio, the massive foundry floors at the Cleveland engine plant adapted to the new reality. The sand-casting molds that had formed the legendary 4V heads and the thick-webbed Boss 351 blocks were quietly retired. The factory shifted its immense volume toward the 350mm, the 400, and smaller displacement engines that could survive the strict new EPA targets and the fuel economy demands of the American consumer. The true 351 Cleveland, the high-winding, massive-breathing, drag-strip terror that had forced the entire American aftermarket to redesign its parts catalogs, was taken off life support. In 1974, the very last American-cast 351 Cleveland blocks rolled off the line in Brook Park. There was no grand ceremony on the factory floor. There was no press release mourning the loss of the best pushrod-breathing architecture Ford had ever designed for the street. The American auto industry was simply too busy trying to survive the oil crisis, the Japanese import wave, and the EPA to care about a discontinued high-performance V8. The machine had not failed. It had done exactly what it was engineered to do. It had moved massive amounts of air, created extreme horsepower, and won on Sunday. But the ecosystem of cheap leaded gas, unregulated exhaust, and lightweight chassis had collapsed around it. The engine still ran. The orders slowed. The rulebook changed. The ports got harder to fill. The factory line moved. The sound faded. The cast iron remained. The world it was built to power was gone. The shutdown of the 351 Cleveland assembly line in Ohio in 1974 did not mean the death of the architecture. In a strange twist of corporate survival, the tooling and the engine design actually found a second life on the other side of the world. Ford of Australia continued to cast, refine, and install the Cleveland V8 in their domestic Falcons and Fairmonts well into the early 1980s, keeping the high RPM legend alive for a completely different continent. But back in the United States, the engine entered a new, deeply entrenched phase of its life cycle. It transitioned from a showroom selling point into a ghost of the American aftermarket. It became a legendary piece of cast iron that simply refused to be forgotten by the mechanics, hot rodders, and racers who knew exactly how to make it breathe. Throughout the late 1970s and the 1980s, as the American auto industry choked on smog pumps, catalytic converters, and primitive electronic carburetors, a massive underground economy formed around the old Ohio blocks. Local drag racers and weekend mechanics began hunting through sprawling salvage yards and junkyards across the Midwest and California. They were looking for wrecked 1970 Torinos, rotting Mercury Cougars, and rolled Mustangs. More specifically, they were looking at the top corners of the cylinder heads. If the casting had a small, raised 4, indicating the massive 4V intake ports, the engine was immediately pulled. It was dragged out of the dirt, loaded into the back of a pickup truck, and brought into home garages to be carefully rebuilt. The Cleveland heads became absolute gold in the American swap meet culture. But as the original, thick-webbed Cleveland engine blocks became harder to find and more expensive to buy, American hot rodders, always pragmatic, invented a hybrid solution. They realized that the architecture of Ford's engine families offered a strange, unintended loophole. With specialized machine work, specifically modifying the coolant passages, a mechanic could take the massive, canted-valve 4V cylinder heads from a dead Cleveland and bolt them directly onto the much more common water-heated block of a 351 Windsor. They called this hybrid engine the Clavor, a portmanteau of Cleveland and Windsor. The Clavor became a garage-built mechanical rebellion against the smog era. By building this hybrid, a mechanic could combine the vast parts availability and lighter weight of the Windsor bottom end with the terrifying high RPM breathing capability of the Cleveland top end. Aftermarket companies like Edelbrock and Wyan quickly realized what was happening in American garages and began casting specialized aluminum intake manifolds specifically designed to make the clever swap work. It proved that the American desire for horsepower would always find a way to circumvent the limits of factory production. If the factory stopped building the ultimate breathing machine, the culture would simply build it themselves using the leftover pieces. Today, the 351 Cleveland holds a unique, almost mythological space in American engine culture. You can still find them at massive automotive swap meets in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or Columbus, Ohio. You will see the heavy cast iron heads sitting on folding tables or wooden pallets, their surfaces stained with decades of old oil, waiting for a buyer who understands exactly what those massive rectangular ports represent. But preserving a 351 Cleveland is not just an act of automotive nostalgia. It is not simply about fondly remembering a time when muscle cars were loud and gasoline was cheap. A surviving 351 Cleveland is a physical, working argument about the limits of internal combustion. It is a cast iron lesson in fluid dynamics. It reminds us that before microprocessors could infinitely adjust valve timing on the fly, and before software could inject fuel with microscopic precision to optimize both power and efficiency, making massive horsepower required a brutal, physical commitment. You had to cast massive intake runners. You had to physically tilt the heavy steel valves. You had to sacrifice low-speed comfort, fuel economy, and smooth idle characteristics in exchange for high-speed dominance. The Cleveland represents the absolute peak of American mechanical airflow before the digital age. The EPA in the global oil markets took over the engine bay. It was a machine perfectly engineered for a specific, fleeting window of American history, a time when the only thing that mattered to a driver was how much fuel and air they could physically pull into a cylinder before the spark plug fired. The foundries in Brook Park have long since moved on. The massive sand cores that originally shaped those 4V heads were broken down and discarded decades ago, but the iron remains. Somewhere in an American garage tonight, under the harsh glow of a fluorescent shop light, a rusted 351 Cleveland block still sits bolted to a heavy steel engine stand. The wide valve covers are off, the canted valves are exposed to the air, and a mechanic is slowly turning the heavy steel crankshaft with a wrench, feeling the mechanical pulse of a machine that was built to breathe deeply, run loudly, and leave everything else behind. See you in the next one.